Welcome to another episode of R&R Living Life. In this episode, Rick and I continue exploring along a number of different highways and major connection roads as we continue our travels through the Mallee Riverina regions of New South Wales. We leave Balranald and make our way along the Mallee Highway to Calatite before taking the Stony Crossing Road to Swan Hill. Our morning spent in Swan Hill saw us exploring the city centre, then on to the Big Cod and reacquainting ourselves with the mighty Murray River. From Swan Hill we took the Noorung Road to Talakul through the Great Sunraysia district in the Riverina to Wakul. From Wakul we followed the Wakul to Deniliquin Road, where for most of the journey we shadowed the Edward and the Yallakul river systems. The amount of water we saw was staggering, as were the irrigation channels. Water usage in this area is huge. We have followed some river systems in our travels, but had never seen the amount of water in the rivers as we were seeing along this stretch of our travels. The area was having an exceptional season. Huge pumps were extracting water from the rivers and fed along irrigation channels and into earth tanks to support intensive farming practices. We saw massive centre pivot irrigators, extensive irrigation channels, huge earth ring tanks, orchards that were water reliant and intensive farming practices. After leaving Swan Hill we passed a couple of historic markers, the first at Talakul that pays tribute to the first commercial rice project in the Murray Valley area, showing the allocation of the first 14 farms balloted in 1948 and the further 10 in 1949 with settlers' names. The second cane marker was at Cobram Homestead, where Frederick Wolseley gained his 5 years of colonial experience. It was here in Thule he dreamed of creating a mechanical method of shearing sheep and in time perfected it. Frederick Wolseley's innovation of sheep shearing machinery revolutionised the entire wool industry. In 1888, Dunlop Station was the site of the first full-scale attempt using the mechanical method of shearing sheep with the shearing of 184,000 sheep. During our Darling River trip, Rick and I visited the historic Dunlop Station shearing shed, and we saw his machine and what was left of the 45 stand shearing shed. On reaching Deniliquin, we spent a couple of days relaxing, taking walks along the Edward River, a tributary of the Murray River which divides the town into two, and exploring. Deniliquin is at the junction of the Cobb and Riverina highways and services a productive agricultural district with prominent rice, wool and timber industries, and was once a busy crossing place where drovers would ford or swim their stock across the Edward River. We left Deniliquin refreshed and ready for more adventures and travelled north along the Cobb Highway across the vast treeless hay plains, one of the flattest places in the southern hemisphere, and over the longest creek in the world, Billabong Creek, near Barubran. We passed through some of the most historically important agricultural country and the small towns of Pretty Pine, Wanganella, Barubran to Hay. We stopped at Black Swamp Rest Area to view the Headless Horseman, a long paddock sculpture that depicts the legend of a headless horseman seen by drovers in the mid-1800s, and past the Royal Mail Hotel built in 1868, which services as a centre for the small village of Barubran, once a staging post on the Cobb and Co stagecoach route. We stopped at historic Wanganella, where in 1861 George Pippin and Sons founded a merino stud. Wanganella was also a relay station for the Cobb and Co coach. We were again traversing saltbush country. This bush and grasses have sustained life for thousands of years. When stock first entered the Riverina area, the salt, cotton and blue bushes were dominant over most of the area, which soon became known as the Saltbush Plains. Not initially regarded as favourable as a stock feed, the pastoralists soon learnt and marvelled at its ability to persist through long periods of drought. It wasn't until after the gold rush period, when Victorian livestock production failed to meet demand for meat, that the incredible value of saltbush and native herbage of the Riverina became truly apparent. The saltbush plains were literally the birthplace of the Australian pippin merino and has become home to many of famous merino stud. By the 1840s, drovers overlanding cattle from western New South Wales and Queensland were passing through Pine Ridge, the site of the modern Balranald, on its way to Port Phillip. They relied on very unreliable water at either Black Swamp or Billabong Creek. We arrived in Hay around mid-morning. Hay, situated on the Murrumbidgee, was originally called Lang's Crossing Place after the Lang brothers, who owned land at the low spot on the Murrumbidgee where sheep and cattle mobs crossed. The township was originally oriented around the wharves which serviced the busy river trade which grew around the stock crossing. The main punt crossing was at Bushy Bend until a timber and iron swing bridge was built in 1874. During the early days of pastoral development, stock trails developed into tracks and eventually, by increasing usage, became stock routes. River crossings along the routes became important points where stock were watered and rested before continuing along the plains. The river trade was once the lifeblood of the area, with the region's major rivers, the Murrumbidgee, the Murray and the Lachlan, being used to transport supplies to remote areas. Barges were also used to bring supplies to properties along the river, often returning with a load of wool. Variable river heights meant river trade was seasonal, as low river restricted boat movement until snow melted upstream on the snowy mountains. The importance of the river trade was also reflected in the construction of the early Hay Bridge, for which one of the most unusual designs seen in the country. Whilst most bridges allowed river traffic through by lifting, the Hay Bridge had a segment that lifted, then swiveled to a 90-degree angle, which allowed boats through. Although the original bridge was replaced in the 1970s, the unique turnstile is still at Bushy Bend. While in Hay, we visited the Niniera Museum, the Hay internment and prisoner of war camp between 1940 and 1946, where thousands of German, Austrian, Italian and Japanese men were interned during World War II. We also visited the Bishop's Lodge Historical House, an early example of sustainable architecture built in 1888 with iron and was designed to withstand the summer heat. Raised ventilating ridges on the hips and ridges of the roof allowed the free movement of air circulation, thus cooling the house. After our visit to the Bishop's Lodge, we continued on our journey along the Sturt Highway, the major east-west route through the Murray-Riverina region between Sydney and Adelaide to Carrathul. Carrathul is a small village situated on the Riverina Plains, 5 kilometres north of the Murrumbidgee River, and began as a town in 1852 when it was established as a way station servicing those travelling between Narrandera and Hay, with river steamers plying the Murrumbidgee from 1858. The settlement was originally located on the river where the river could be safely crossed. Carrathul was the first river town along the Murrumbidgee. In 1882, when the railway arrived, the town was moved 5 kilometres north to where it is today. Our camp that night was on the banks of the Murrumbidgee River at the Carrathul Truss Bridge. Rick and I enjoyed a quiet afternoon relaxing beside the river, but woke to a very frosty morning. After a very foggy start, we left our camp at Carrathul and continued along the Sturt Highway to Darling Point. The first half hour was slower than normal, as in places it was very difficult to see more than a car's length in front, and being a major highway, semi-trailers didn't slow down and suddenly appeared out of the fog, thankfully on the right side of the road. Darlington Point, on the banks of the Murrumbidgee, is a quiet service centre that began its life, like many destinations in the Riverina, as a river crossing before being developed into an agricultural hub producing fruit, vegetables and grains. Further along we passed through Whitton, which was originally a focal point for workers transporting goods and people into southwestern areas of New South Wales in the 1850s. The rail line arrived in Whitton in 1881, and the rail station became the nucleus of the town. Just a short drive further along is the town of Lytton, with its Art Deco buildings along the main street. Unlike most country towns, Lytton did not develop around the local pub, supply store or railway station. It was built as part of the Riverina region's Balranald irrigation scheme. Many of the people who live in Lytton have an Italian heritage. After World War II, many of the Italian immigrants to Australia were experienced farmers who were drawn to the Riverina area. 5 kilometres further along Irrigation Way was Yanco, home of Tokal College, which began as the Yanco Experiment Farm that was developed in 1908 to determine what the area could grow. In the early years, even when it became a home for delinquent boys, then a POW camp, crop trials were conducted on the property, which continue today, with research taking place into the efficient and sustainable production of rice, cotton, citrus fruits, cereals, canola, soybeans and pulses. Yanco was first established when the local railway line arrived in the area in 1881, when the line was extended from Narrandera to Hay. In 1829, Captain Charles Sturt passed near where the present Narrandera River Bridge is. 7 years later, the government opened the way for squatters to take up land in the area. When gold was discovered in Victoria, overlanders regularly crossed the Murrumbidgee at Narrandera, taking stock to fill the demand for meat in the goldfields. A river punt was built in 1852 to ferry passengers and stock south across the river to Gillingar, an outpost of Bockingbock Station that was settled in 1839. A dispute erupted between the workers from Narrandera Run and passengers wanting to cross regarding where the village would be situated. In 1881, the government surveyed a site that covered both sides of the river, and Narrandera was gazetted as a crossing place and the punt protected from further disputes. But it wasn't until 1863 the village of Narrandera was finally proclaimed. From Narrandera, we followed the Newell Highway to Grong Grong, Gaineman, Coolamon and on to Old Junee, where we camped overnight at the reserve just out of town on the Olympic Highway. We were far enough off the highway that noise was not a problem. From our camp, we watched sheep grazing across the creek, but were appalled at the number of rabbits at the reserve. It turned out to be one of the coldest mornings we had had on our journey. In 1885, a petition from local residents was sent to the government to rectify the confusion around Old Junee. The original Junee was called Junee Junction, and the current Junee that was then called Loftus. This petition resulted in the original town becoming Old Junee and Loftus becoming officially known as Junee. You would think that all would be clear from now on, but no, the railway continued to be called Junee Junction until well into the second half of the 20th century, and the post office did not change its name until 1893. Junee is a pretty country town situated halfway between Sydney and Melbourne and is home to a fascinating roundhouse railway museum, one of the few working roundhouses left in the world. When it opened in the 1940s, it had a unique 33-metre turntable, the largest in the Southern Hemisphere. Surrounding the railway station is the Railway Square shops, dating from 1923 to 1925, and were originally the site for the Railway Gasworks, which provided the station refreshment rooms and hotel with gas for lighting. Junee is divided into an east and west, with 22 places of interest on the eastern side and 11 places of interest on the western side of the railway line. Today, the town's prosperity is based on a combination of agriculture, rail transport, light industry and government services, in particular the correctional services. From Old Junee we made our way to Junee along the Olympic Highway and then on to Cootamundra and Cowra. We spent the morning in Junee exploring all the wonderful old buildings and visiting the Junee Licorice and Chocolate Factory located in an old flour mill where we indulged in some very delicious morning tea. Licorice is said to really be the unsung hero of the confectionery world. It's been around for over 4,000 years, and even some of the most historic figures consumed licorice for its medicinal benefits. Apparently Napoleon loved it so much it is said that his teeth turned black from the juices. Between Junee and Cootamundra we stopped at the Bithungra rail spiral, that is one of Australia's most significant rail engineering feats of its time. The spiral itself is one of only two 360-degree rail spirals of its type in Australia. The section required cutting up to 27 metres deep and two tunnels that were cut through grey and pink granite, some of the hardest rock to be found in Australia. Heavy goods traffic on the Great Southern Line, which opened in 1878, increased significantly in the early 1900s, with population growth in both Sydney and Melbourne, and the need for agriculture and rural industries to develop. The range of hills at Bithungra was providing a handicap, with heavy goods trains requiring a banked locomotive to assist in pushing them up both the north and southbound grades of the single track. In essence, the hills were too steep for the locomotives to traverse the line without assistance. Just a short drive further along the Olympic Highway, we arrived at Cootamundra on Marama Creek. On our arrival, we stopped at the Captain's Walk, which features 42 bronze sculptures of Australian Test cricket captains, along with the leading Aboriginal player in the first Australian cricket team to tour England in 1868. Cootamundra was the birthplace of Sir Donald Bradman, universally regarded as the greatest batsman of all time, though he never lived in the town, and the former home of Bill Murdoch, both Test captains for Australia. Cootamundra was also once a flourishing gold rush town in the 1860s. Today, agriculture is big business in the district. We made our next camp at the showgrounds in Young. We had only just unhooked and connected water and power, then it decided to rain. Young sits in a deep valley and is at the heart of the Hilltops region. I am always interested in the architecture in these small rural towns, and Young was no different. We visited the elegant 1885 railway station building, the Young Museum, housed in the 1883 schoolhouse and tells the story of the 1861 riots against energetic Chinese miners, the Town Hall, the largest in country New South Wales, with its clock tower, a magnificent World War I war memorial. Rick and I will leave you for this episode as we leave Young and continue along the Olympic Highway. Join us next time as we explore Cowra in the Lachlan Valley, made famous as the site of a breakout of Japanese POWs in 1944, and then onto the historic town of Grenfell, steeped in gold rush history and bushranger legends, set against the stunning backdrop of the Wedding Mountains and the birthplace of Henry Lawson. I hope you have enjoyed watching this snapshot of what we have seen along our travels. Cheers for now, Rick and Rosemary, R&R